It's good to have you at Freedom today, and a joy to welcome in those of you who are now tuning in online to worship with us. Or maybe you're catching this later in the week in an archived version. Either way, glad to have you take part in what's happening at Freedom. We have been in a series this summer entitled Unexpected Heroes, and I hope that you have enjoyed that. I enjoy the stories from the Old Testament, but if we're honest, a lot of the characters that we've talked about so far have been the kind of heroes that they wind up either leading in battle or, leading a nation, or they're kind of in positions that most of us are never going to be in. And in some ways, that can make that part of their story hard to relate to. And today is going to be the big exception to that. Today is going to be a completely different kind of story. Today is going to be a love story. How many of you, by a show of hands, love a good love story? I see a few men in the room willing to raise their hands. That's all right, guys. It's good to love a good love story. The thing that makes this just stand out in stark contrast is where this love story falls. Now, most of the last several weeks we've been in the book of Judges. And man, the book of Judges, it's like a rated R movie for blood and violence. It's just all this killing and fighting that's been going on. And if you look at the flow of the Old Testament, it really is, at first glance, it's kind of odd because, you've got the whole Exodus story in 4 books of the Bible, mighty Moses leading in this whole great adventure through the wilderness for 40 years, and then Joshua for years leading in the conquest of the land, and that's followed by Judges. 300 years of this roller coaster ride of sin and disobedience and repentance, and then God raising up a judge, and we fight the battle and we fight off the oppressors, and 6 different times you repeat this, and about a bazillion people die in the book of Judges. And then we're going to jump from the period of the Judges straight into Samuel and Kings, where Saul and then David and then Solomon and then the divided kingdom after them. It's the monarchy and all of the stuff that's going to happen under these great leaders, and some of them lousy leaders, but all of these adventures. And sandwiched right in between all of that, between the Judges and Samuel, we get this little book of Ruth. A love story thrown in the midst of all of this fighting and killing. And God says, but I want you to see another side of life. And He gives us the little tiny book of Ruth. If you've got your Bibles, you can turn with me to the book of Ruth. And that's probably not one that some of us are real familiar with. So if you're looking for it in the Old Testament, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. If you get to Samuel and Kings, turn left. The book of Ruth takes place, as I said, that the period of the Judges was about 300 years. Ruth takes place somewhere during the final 50 or 100 years of the period of the Judges. And I'm going to just take several minutes to tell you the whole story. And I encourage you, if you haven't read Ruth in a long time, go home today or this week and just read the story. It only takes you 15 minutes to read the whole book. It's that short. But I'm going to just tell you the story, and then I'm going to rewind, and we're just going to talk about a few things in there that are instructive for us, that are really worth taking home in that story. But first, just the story that unfolds there. We begin in Ruth with 2 characters who are just a Jewish couple living in Bethlehem. Their names are Naomi and Elimelech. If you're going to have kids or grandkids and you're looking for a name, there's a keeper. Elimelech. Naomi and Elimelech. They're just a nobody couple who live in Bethlehem. Yes, that Bethlehem. The Bethlehem that David's going to be born in. The Bethlehem that Jesus is going to be born in. And the first thing that happens in the story is a famine comes upon the land. That's not such a big deal for us today. That just means we're going to pay more in the grocery store. Not so back then. If a famine came for 1 year, you probably could survive it living where you are. If it's a multi-year drought and famine, you're probably going to have to relocate to keep from starving to death. This was a lengthy, prolonged famine, so they had to pack their stuff and move to another land. And so they left Bethlehem, they went east, they went all the way around the Dead Sea over to the land of Moab. Everybody say Moab. Doesn't sound like a happy place to live, does it? They've had to leave not only their home city, but leave their country and go to live among the Moabites. And when they get there, they have taken with them their 2 sons. Their names are Machlon and Kilion. Tell me that's not a couple of Klingon names right there for the Star Trekkies in the room. So it's Elimelech, Naomi, Machlon, and Kilion have gone to Moab to live. And the 3 major things that happen when they're in Moab, first of all, the sons, they are of age, and they start looking for women, and they find a couple of Moabite women that they fall in love with, and they marry. One of them's name is Orpah, not Oprah, it looks like Oprah, but Orpah and Ruth. They get married. That's the first major occurrence. The second major occurrence is daddy dies. Elimelech he disappears during the first act of the story. And that's a major thing because men played such a big role. Men were the ones who made the money. They were the ones who made decisions. They were the ones who had standing in the community. So for the dad to be removed from the picture put the family in great jeopardy. And then the third thing that happened in Moab that was really just a double whammy is that both Mahlon and Chilion died. And so now we're left with just 3 women in the family. Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth, with no men left whatsoever. So they were incredibly vulnerable. And this was a time where women had not only no standing, but there just were essentially no jobs for them. I mean, for a single woman, for a widow, it was very, very difficult to keep food on the table and keep your clothes on in the process. It was that kind of environment. Very, very difficult situation for them. And so the question becomes, what are we going to do now? We've been 10 years in this land, and now there's not a famine back home, but what are we going to do? And so Naomi decides, I'm going back to Bethlehem, and the 2 daughters-in-law say, well, we'll go with you. And so they start the journey back. And they're not too far down the road when Naomi stops and looks at her daughters-in-law and says, this just doesn't make sense. I'm going home to my people to try and make a new life for myself. But what are you doing? Because you don't have anybody there. You're not even Jewish. And she said, if I got married and had a son in the next year, what good's that going to do you? Are you going to wait around 20 years to have kids by them? That wouldn't work. You two just better go back to your home city and just try and make a life for yourselves there. And Orpah said, okay, sounds like a good idea to me. And she checks out. And Ruth, in response to that, she says that thing that you've heard many times before. If you haven't read it in the scriptures, you've at least heard it at weddings. It's interesting because these words are not between a man and a woman. They were spoken by Ruth to her mother-in-law. But she said those famous words in response to Naomi's appeal that she should go back home. And she said, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. For where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. Isn't that such a classic, wonderful passage? And in response to that, Naomi says, okay, you can come with me. Now, the thing that's really striking as you read through chapter 1 is to find how these same events that have unfolded for both Naomi and for Ruth have had such a different effect on the two of them, because Ruth in this whole exchange is so willing to flex and to just do whatever she needs to do, and Naomi in all of this has just become hurt, angry, and bitter. And she says to her daughters, as bad as this was for you, it ain't as bad for you as it is for me. Don't you love people like that no matter what you're going through, they've got to tell you, you think your situation's bad, well, let me tell you about mine. You think you're sick. You think you had a bad surgery. Let me tell you what a worse one I had. So Naomi says that. She says, you think it's bad for you. It's worse for me. And in fact, when she gets back home, when they arrive, and the women all say, glory be. After 10 years, could this be Naomi? And she just cuts them off. Says, don't even call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara. Because Mara means bitter. And so she's being a drama queen in this. Just don't even call me by my name anymore. Just call me the bitter woman, because I'm bitter at God. God's been mean to me, and I'm mad at God for it. I mean, that's basically Naomi's response right now in the story. So as they arrive and they begin to try and figure out how they're going to make a life for themselves, you can imagine they arrive essentially broke. And so now how are we going to put food on the table? And they arrive at the time of the barley harvest. And Ruth says, well, I'll tell you what, I'll go out into the field. I'll find a field where they're harvesting barley, and I'll glean there. Now, in their day, there was no welfare system. There was no unemployment check to be collected. And so the closest thing to any welfare plan that they had was, at the time of the harvest, if you weren't employed by the person who owned that field, and you didn't have a field to harvest, you could go out and you could glean behind the harvesters. You couldn't go into the unpicked areas and pick anything, but you could just stay behind the harvesters, and anything that fell on the ground or that got overlooked, you could pick up those occasional stalks of grain. Now, as you can imagine, you couldn't make a living doing this, but you could just keep from starving. You know, if you stayed at it all day and you collected the few heads of grain on the ground, you could make probably a meal or two for yourself and you know, maybe a mate. And it would be a tough way to make a living, but you could just barely keep from starving during the harvest season. And so Ruth said, I'll go out and do that. So she goes out. She starts early in the morning. She goes to the field of a man named Boaz that she has heard was a close relative of her father-in-law. And so she probably thought, well, maybe, you know, he'll be nice to me and let me glean there. And so she gets in behind the women who are harvesting, and for hours she's gleaning. And when Boaz finally comes in, he's a man of standing in the community, and when he goes to check on things, he asks his foreman, and he says, who is that young lady back there that's gleaning behind the harvesters? And he says, oh, her name is Ruth, and she's come in from another country. And he goes, oh, I know who you're talking about. I've heard her story and just all that she has done for my relative Naomi. And he's moved by that, and he immediately goes to her and he says, now listen, ma'am, I don't want you to go and look for other fields to glean in, because you might get hurt. He understood the situation. It would be so easy for a single woman alone like that to be taken advantage of. And he says, I don't want you to be harmed. And so you just stay near the women who work for me, and you glean behind them. And as they go from field to field, you just stay in my fields. And he said, if you get thirsty when my men draw water, you just come and you drink from the water that they've drawn, just like my servants would. And you just stay with our group. And she just says, you know, thank you that you're being more than kind to me. And so when lunchtime rolls around, which is about 6 hours into their workday, and his workers come in to eat. Of course, she doesn't have a sack lunch to bring to the table, but he says, you come on in and eat with us. You take some of our bread, you share in our wine vinegar, and here, have some roasted grain with us. And so she eats with them, and they have an exchange where he lets his foreman and his men know, I don't want you to touch this woman. And he speaks to them then away from Ruth. He says, I don't want you to let any harm come to her. And in fact, I want you to make sure that you leave behind plenty of grain, even if you have to pull some out of your sheaves that you've collected. You make sure wherever she's collecting that there's a grain to be collected. And if somehow she should accidentally get sort of into an unpicked part of the field, don't correct her, don't embarrass her. You just make sure that she's taken care of. And so, you know, you would expect from just gleaning that by the time that you go through and winnow that out, that you'd only have just a tiny little, you know, amount maybe for you and another person to have a meal. But after the way that she's been taken care of that day, at the end of the day, she threshes that out, and it says that she comes away from her first long day of work threshed out with the finished product with 6 gallons of finished barley. Can you just imagine a day of gleaning, and you can't even bring it in a 5-gallon bucket? And she brings that home to her mother-in-law, and Naomi goes, where in the world have you been gleaning? And she said, you know, this very nice man Boaz let me glean in his field. And she's like, oh, wonderful. He is a kinsman redeemer. He's a close relative of ours. You keep going back to his field. So for the rest of the barley harvest, she does exactly what Boaz has said to do. She works long days. And then that goes right into the wheat harvest, and she continues that through the wheat harvest and gets taken care of each day. And so now Naomi is starting to think like a mother or mother-in-law, and she's wanting to play the matchmaker. And so she says, all right, Ruth, now it's time for you to take the next step. You're always out in the fields and dirty and sweaty, and thank you for doing that. But Boaz needs to see another side of you. Go take a bath. Go put on some perfume. How many of you, by the way, are watching the show on PBS right now, Pole Dark? Has anybody seen that? No, nobody, but there's just a couple of, isn't that a great series? The male lead and the woman that he's following, she starts off so dirty, but she cleans up pretty good, doesn't she? It really reminds me of the Ruth story. If you haven't seen that, such a great positive series on PBS right now. I'm sorry, that was an unplanned aside there, but the kitchen wench that becomes the wife, she cleans up about like Ruth did. So Naomi says, bathe yourself, put on your best perfume, and here's what I want you to do. Now, this is the part in the story that'll sound a little weird to us, but that's okay, because if we had tried to explain to them about how you make a friend request when you want to begin to connect with somebody on Facebook, they wouldn't have gotten it back then. So she said, all right, here's what you do. Go to the threshing floor where Boaz is going to be threshing out the wheat tonight. And when he's had dinner and he's had some wine and he beds down, after he goes to sleep, you go and lay at his feet and uncover his feet and just kind of go from there. And there was nothing sexual or untoward about what she was being told to do. So she goes in all perfumed up and fixed up. And when Boaz is completely asleep, she goes and uncovers his feet. So he's going to get cold during the night and have occasion to wake up. And then she lays at his feet. She doesn't like trying to do anything inappropriate getting next to him. She just lays at his feet. And so in the middle of the night, he wakes up, cold feet, and he looks down at his feet that are completely uncovered, and he sees a woman laying there. And he says, "Who is this?" And she said, "It's your servant, Ruth. Would you, my kinsman redeemer, be willing to just let the corner of your blanket cover me?" Well, to us, we're like, what kind of weird game is this? But you see, in that culture, in that time, he understood exactly what that meant. Because for starters, she referred to him as her kinsman redeemer. You see, that was a packed term, packed with a meaning. Because in that day, because women were so vulnerable when they were widowed or divorced, and there was just hardly any help to be had for them, the system of the day called for the closest relative of the deceased husband to come in and to redeem the land that she had owned that probably was now in jeopardy, buy the land to make sure that the family doesn't lose the land, and to marry the woman so that she now has someone to provide for her and take care of her. And that is a kinsman redeemer. Your closest male relative was supposed to do that. I know that sounds weird to us, but that was what happened in that day. And it protected the women. And so when she looked at him and said, you know, "I'm your servant Ruth, and since you are my kinsman redeemer, would you just cover me with the corner of your blanket?" The whole thing of being covered by the corner of your blanket is really a nice little symbol of what she's really asking for by referring to him as the kinsman redeemer, because it's kind of like, with all that you have, would you be willing to sort of cover my life and my need with sort of the corner of what you have? But in that, there is sort of the open invitation of, would you be willing to take me in and to marry me? And Boaz is so touched by this. And he says, "Oh, goodness, you could have gone after any of the younger men." Boaz was apparently quite a bit older than her. But he said, "You didn't chase after them." And essentially what he says is, yes, I most certainly will do that. But he explains to her, and he covers her up, and it's appropriate when he does that night. And he explains, there is one other person who is a closer kinsman redeemer. And he gets first right of refusal for you and your land. And so we're going to have to deal with that. So he covers her up for the night. She sleeps there, and they get up the next morning before anybody else is awake. She's going to run back home. And he says, "Wait a minute, before you go, give me your shawl." And he takes a bunch of the grain that he's threshed out the night before. He fills her shawl with food. And he says, "Take this back for you and Naomi." And she goes back. And so immediately then he goes out to find 10 of the city elders and the other kinsman redeemer. And he gets them all together. And it's kind of a setup. So he goes to his relative, the other kinsman redeemer, who's got the first shot at Ruth and the land. And he says, "All right, in case you haven't heard, Naomi and Ruth have come from Moab, and you are the kinsman redeemer, and they've got land that's in jeopardy. So are you willing to do the job of the kinsman redeemer and buy the land to protect the land for them?" And he says, "Yes, I'm willing to do that. I'll purchase the land." And he said, "Okay, well, just so we're clear, the land also comes with a woman. With the land, you're going to need to take Ruth as your wife." And he goes, "I don't think so. I don't want another woman in my life. You're the next kinsman redeemer. You think she needs to be taken care of? You buy the land and you take the woman. I'm out of here." And he walks away. And so Boaz looks at the 10 elders and he says, "Well, you've heard it. Now I agree. I'll purchase the land and I'll come in and be the kinsman redeemer for Ruth." And so in the final chapter, Ruth and Boaz are married, and God blesses her with the ability to have a child. And by the way, Naomi gets ministered to in this. She finally, after her bitterness, has joy again, because now she sees Boaz come into the family and they're taken care of, and she finally gets a grandson out of the deal. And the conclusion of the story is not just that the two of them come together as husband and wife, but Ruth and Boaz have a son, and his name is Obed, which is a long list of great baby names here. And Obed may not mean a lot to us, but then Obed has a son, and it starts getting interesting then, because his son's name is Jesse. Ruth has a grandson, Jesse. We know that name, and not just from the Dukes of Hazzard. This isn't Uncle Jesse. This is a different Jesse. This is Jesse who has 8 sons. In the book of Samuel, we know Jesse. Jesse lives in Bethlehem, and Jesse's baby boy, the runt that keeps the sheep, we all know his son because his name is David. David would become the second king in Israel and the greatest king that Israel would ever know in the past 3,500 years. David would have many sons, and one of those sons would be named Solomon. While David was the greatest king Israel ever had, under Solomon's rule, he was the wisest king that ever reigned, and Israel was the largest, strongest, and most powerful that they've ever been in the last 3,500 years. This would be the great-grandson and the great-great-grandson of Ruth and Boaz. And then many generations later, they would have a great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson, and his name would be Jesus. In the middle of all of this fighting and dying and rebellion and coming back to God, we get this wonderful little love story of Ruth and Boaz. Why does God tell us this? Why does He insert this in here? I think, among other things, because it serves as a powerful reminder as we look at all of these unexpected heroes in the Old Testament, broken, peculiar people that God used in significant ways. It serves as a powerful reminder that for most of us, the place where we have the greatest opportunity to do something noble, significant, and heroic, it's not on the battlefield, it's not in political office, it's at home. It's with your family. Ruth and Boaz never held political office. They never led an army. And yet they proved to be very significant characters in God's story. Now I want us to just back up for a minute and consider, I'm just going to point out, I'm not going to talk for a long time about most of these, but I just want to point out 6 things that are just kind of noteworthy about their story and hopefully instructive for us today. Backing up, I want to just begin by saying a word about Ruth, and she's the one the whole story revolves around, that death and desperation were the things that shaped Ruth's character. I mean, when she appears in the story, she's married to one of Naomi and Elimelech's sons, but it's like the first thing that happens is your father-in-law's dead. And then the next thing that happens, your brother-in-law's dead and your husband is dead. And it's just interesting that we're given this contrast of here are these 2 women who remain in that, Naomi and Ruth, and how it has opposite effects on the 2 of them. Everybody in life is going to have difficulty, hurt, major setbacks and losses in life. If it hadn't come your way, it will. And for some of you, you've already had a truckload of it. Adversity comes in every life. Adversity comes to both of these women. And for Naomi, it caused bitterness. It is a reminder that when adversity comes, it's going to make you bitter or it's going to make you better. Rest assured, it will do one or the other. For Naomi, she said, I don't even want to be called Naomi anymore. Call me the bitter one because I'm mad at God. And it is her character is a good reminder for us that when the really big bad stuff comes your way, I don't mean the little annoying things like you didn't get the parking place that you wanted or, whatever, you didn't get in the class that you wanted or the cubicle you wanted. No, the big stuff. You lost the job that you loved. You lost the man or woman that you loved. You lost your business. You lost your house. Big losses that happen. When those things happen, and you're tempted to really wrestle with the question of why, it's easy to go the route that Naomi went. She said, God did this to me. This is God's fault. I mean, now, before we pick on Naomi, let's just say, you lose your spouse and both of your kids, you're going to ask some hard questions, aren't you? Don't you think so? If your spouse died and all of your kids died, don't you think you'd ask some hard questions? We'd probably all go through a season where we'd be pointing a finger at God and going, what is your deal? Why are you doing this to me? So lest we are unkind in our treatment of her, I understand why Naomi would spend a season like she did. She went through a very bitter season. But it's interesting that during that very same season, Ruth lost her husband, she lost her brother-in-law, she lost her father-in-law. She basically lost all the covering she had over her. And yet, in all of that, it was building character instead of building bitterness. She was getting better instead of bitter, which leads us to the question of, all right, well, so how did she become better? Well, the things that stand out for her, first of all, were just faithfulness and loyalty really begin to set Ruth apart. And it's the passage that I read a while ago where you see that Ruth, when confronted with this kind of loss, we all, when we're confronted with a loss like this, or similar things to this, we all tend to respond in one of two ways. Think about this and see if it isn't true. When you have gone through the biggest hurts and the biggest relational losses, and the main two ways that these will happen are through, breakup and divorce, or death, right? I mean, those are the biggies. Your boyfriend or girlfriend or fiance or spouse leaves you. Oh, it just leaves a crater in your heart. The person that you've given your heart to when they die. Or, and it can have a similar effect when it's a parent that you were really close to that dies. And just the hole that leaves. The way that we tend to respond to that is usually one of two things. That we will either, when we've experienced tremendous hurt, especially if that's been compounded with some other secondary big losses, is that we can become just completely distrustful of people in general. The person that I loved and I gave my heart to, they left me. And so I can't help it. I just don't trust people now. By the way, I know what that feels like. And a bunch of you do too, don't you? The person that I loved, if you've been through being cheated on and your heart's saying, the one that I knew would always be faithful to me hasn't been faithful to me. And so now, if I can't trust them, I can't trust anybody. And so there's the potential of the two ways that we can go, that we will just become distrustful of the whole world. And we won't let our hearts get really close to anyone because we don't believe we could really completely trust and open up to anyone, because we're probably going to get trashed and used by them the way that we've been trashed or abandoned by. And any number of hurts and things can create this, just the loss of death. It's still, even though at some level we can sort of go, well, that's crazy. I mean, you can't get mad over somebody dying. They couldn't help that. It can still have the same effect on you. But I needed you. I was depending on you, and you're not there for me anymore. And it's just easy to become distrustful and to pull back. You're going to go one of two ways. You're either going to become distrustful and shrink back from people, or you'll go the route that Ruth went, where instead of distrust that pulls back from people, you cherish the relationships that you do have. You take the very opposite approach that says, I have hurt and I've lost so much, and rather than distrusting everyone because of that, I am so grateful that I now have someone in my life who loves me and who is still here for me. And am I having to take a chance in that? Sure. But I'm going to be so loyal to them. I'm going to pour that much more into them because I now have somebody, after I lost so much and felt like I'd never be whole again, there's still somebody in my life to love me. And here's the interesting thing that we learn from Ruth in that. She doesn't have to wait until there's a romantic lead who enters the picture. She sows that kind of love in a relationship that's not weird. Boy, in the 21st century, we'd turn this into something screwy, wouldn't we? If we made a TV show out of it, they'd be a gay couple. They would. You know how we just screw stuff up today. We'd try and create something weird between Ruth and Naomi that's not there. No. I mean, the words that she expresses to her are of just true friendship and loyalty. And it's interesting. When I was in seminary, the last Hebrew class, the most advanced Hebrew class that you had to take, you wind up having to do a lot of translation. We had to translate the whole book of Ruth from Hebrew. I'm so glad it was Ruth and not Isaiah. 4 chapters instead of 66. I thought I'd never translate that one little book. But the neatest passage in the whole book to translate is that wonderful little monologue that Ruth speaks to Naomi. In Hebrew, it reads a bit differently than what it does in English. We add some words to it to make it flow more sweetly. As I said, you know, when we read it, it's the whole thing of your people will be my people and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die. In the Hebrew, it almost sounds like caveman talk, but it's also, it just grabs you when you can read it in Hebrew. She just goes, your people, my people. Your God, my God. You go, I go. You stay, I stay. You die, I die. I don't know. Just seeing that in the original language, it's just powerful. It's like, boy, there's no wondering about where she stands in that. Bottom line, I'm linked to you. I'm reaching out to you, and I'm telling you, whatever your experience is, you won't go through it alone, because I'll share with you in the good and the bad. Man, it's just powerful. She didn't shrink back. Instead, she reached out and said, hey, I'm not left with much. I'm left with a mother-in-law. Boy, that's a rough life, ain't it? I mean, when you're left with one, think about it, you know, for most people, if you're going to be left with one person, you get your mother-in-law. Well, that's what she got. Actually, my mother-in-law's in the room, and I'd be happy to be left with you, Miss Beck. I do have a great mother-in-law. That's who she's left with, is her mother-in-law. And she says, I'm going to cherish what I have. I'm going to pursue that relationship, and it's going to be good. So, boy, that's just a powerful thing that we see in her. She's not bitter, she's better, she's faithful, she's loyal. And there's one other thing that we'll say about Ruth before we move on, and that is the third point. That Ruth just consistently worked so hard to provide for her household. And it may be like, well, how heroic is that? Let me tell you, in that situation, it's completely heroic. Life and death hang in the balance. Starvation and survival hang in the balance here. Naomi's getting old, and Ruth is just, I mean, no insult to women, but just one woman to go out and provide for a family in a world that doesn't embrace women. And so her response to that isn't, oh, we've got to find someone to help us. No, her response is, as soon as they get back to the land, well, I'm going to get up early tomorrow, and I'm going to hit the field, and I'm going to work hard, and I'm going to make sure at the end of the day there's something to bring home for us to eat at night. And the scripture says she worked all day long. In fact, when Boaz shows up hours into the workday and he points her out and asks about her, the foreman says, oh yeah, that woman, she has been working since the start of the day. She's only taken one little break in the course of the day in all this heat. She has just stayed out there in it. And as the story unfolds, she works the whole day, and when the day's done, then she threshes all of her barley, and she does it day after day after day. I want to tell you, there is nothing glorious about what she's doing. If you've ever had to work the fields, and most of us probably have not, there's not enough gray hair in the room, you'll note she was busting her backside to put food on the table. That's heroic. And I just want to tell you honestly, I have a grave concern. I'm not trying to be dramatic. I really have a grave concern that we, in my generation, have sabotaged the generation behind us because we have failed to teach them a heroic work ethic. We have failed to teach them a mediocre work ethic. In the name of making life easier for them, or wanting them to be happy and well-rounded and get to play every sport, or I don't know in the name of what, but in the name of something stupid, we have failed to teach a generation how to get out and work hard and sweat and be responsible. And it is coming back to bite us. And worse still, it's coming back to bite them in a terrible way. I was talking to a church member who's one of our more mature members, and I won't call his name because he's in the room, but we were talking about this very issue a week or two ago, and about this thing that we all see happening around us, where there's a generation that's coming of age and arriving at the age where you're supposed to be working hard, oftentimes working the hardest to get into your career and to make a go of things, and how there are so many who are just kind of floundering, and it's like, well, I don't know, I'm not crazy about this job, and it's just not really capturing my heart, and I'm not sure that it's me, and I don't know that I want to stay with that, and I may want to go back to school again or go home with mom and dad for a while. And we were just kind of laughing about what a crazy situation it is. That, this whole thing of, I just don't know what I think about this, and I don't know how I feel about that now that I've been doing it for a while. And it's like, somewhere in this, we got to figure out it's called work for a reason. They don't call it playtime. This is why they pay us to do it. If it were so much fun, we'd all just have hobbies for a living, and you wouldn't need to pay us to do it. And this church member made a comment which I greatly appreciated. He had spent decades in a particular career field and had done well in that. And he said, I'm glad to have been able to do that. But there were parts of that were hard. There were days that I hated going to work, had to do things that I did not want to have to do. If I hadn't been paid to do it, I wouldn't have shown up to do it. But he said, here's the thing that made the difference. When I was much younger, starting out working, I cleaned out sewer lines for a living. Think about that one for a minute. He said, and when I wasn't cleaning out sewer lines, I had a job working in the field. I think it was harvesting hay and something else that he harvested. And he said, after having some seasons of cleaning out sewer lines and harvesting stuff in the field, it actually felt like a bit of a treat to get to go into a career field that had a future and some longevity and stability to it. And even though there was a hard side to it, I was willing to stick with that after the hard work I'd had to do before. And boy, my heart just immediately resonates with that. And I just think back to how I grew up. And many of you would identify with how I grew up. I didn't have a hard life growing up. I just had a normal life growing up. But I'm so grateful that I had parents who, when we were young, made us work. When you were too young to sort of go out officially into the workplace, you still cut the grass, and you cut as many neighbors' yards as you could find that would let you cut their yards, and you were responsible around the house to take care of things in the house, to vacuum and to clean the bathrooms and to set the table and to take out the trash and to wash the dishes. And if you didn't do those things, there was a paddle in the closet that was going to come out and remind you to make sure you didn't forget tomorrow to do those things. And I did not have cruel parents. I had really good parents. And when we got just a little bit older, where we were allowed to actually work in my dad's business, Saturday was not a play day. Saturday you worked from 8 to 5. And summers weren't summers to kick back. Summers were time to work. I remember 3 of the summers in my later teenage years, I had the special privilege of going and working at a place called the Vineyard. And we, every week, worked 75 to 80 hours a week. And boy, I remember especially that first year, we every week would cut multiple acres of grass in yard with a push mower. And what we couldn't push mow, we had the sling blade. And then we took care of the facility, which meant you had about 24 toilets to clean several times a week, and all of the bathrooms, and scrubbing the floors, and just taking care of all of those things. And by the time I had done that for 3 summers, I had appropriate motivation that when I went to college, it felt like a privilege. It didn't feel like such a burden to go into an air-conditioned classroom and pay attention and take notes and to go home and study. And I was determined. I wasn't going to clean. There's nothing wrong with cleaning toilets and cutting grass for a living. But I felt pretty determined that I was going to take advantage of the opportunities that I had. And those things became the training ground to stick with it in college, because I got married early in college. And then I still had 2 more years of college left after marriage and 4.5 years of grad school. I didn't know how hard that would be, working 2 and 3 jobs at a time while going to school full time. And looking back on it, I realized I probably wouldn't have survived those things and been able to take care of a family and work things out so that my wife could stay home to be with our kids. I don't think I would have had the stuff to survive that and work multiple jobs while going to school had it not been for parents who taught me a work ethic. Had it not been for some summers where I worked my tail off in jobs that weren't glorious and honestly weren't fun, but they were shaping me to have a work ethic. And so many of you could stand up and share similar stories. Now here's my question to you. What happened? What happened when we had our kids? Are we teaching our kids that same kind of work ethic? Because they may not face the same predicament that Ruth did, but you rest assured there will be a testing. The world is not waiting with open arms saying, come on 21-year-olds, we want to sign you all up for a $90,000 a year starting salary with all the benefits in the world, and we don't want you to work a long week. Reality's tough, isn't it? Chances are when your kids are 22 and 23 and 24, one job won't pay the bills. It's going to take more than one. It's going to take tireless effort. And it's probably not going to start out at a level that's going to be fun. It's going to take some heart. And that really falls back on us, doesn't it, as parents and grandparents, to teach our kids when they're coming along. And a lot of that comes in the little things. Giving them responsibilities, not because we couldn't handle the task, but because we don't want to hamstring them in life. And so we teach them character and work ethic. Are you with me? Say, uh-huh. All right, we'll move on. The fourth thing I'll point out is this. When Boaz comes in the story, the part that sets Boaz apart is just his generosity and compassion. Just in all things. He was the guy that was comfortable, and life is good, and yet he really cared about the people who were around him. Boaz said to Ruth when he encounters her, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the girls. I've told the men not to touch you, and whenever you're thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars that the men have filled." And then later in the story, when she sat down with the harvesters, and this is the day he's just met her, Boaz offered her some roasted grain, and she ate all that she wanted and had some left over. And when she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some of the stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." And if we had time, it just goes on and on. What you see is just a heart of concern and generosity. And I'm not going to talk about this anymore. I'm just going to ask this question. When you encounter people who are in need, do you see them as just a hindrance and a nuisance to be avoided so that you can get on with your day? Or do you see hurting, needy people as an opportunity to directly love and serve Jesus? Because Jesus said, when you feed the hungry, when you give water to those who are thirsty, when you clothe the naked, when you take care of the least of these, you've done it to me. Boaz had that heart, that he wasn't comfortable to just go, well, I'm taking care of me, you take care of you. No, he was looking, he was concerned, he was generous with what he had. And the other thing we'll say about Boaz is he just stands out in the story as being like Jesus in that he was the true kinsman redeemer. A kinsman redeemer, it's a foreign concept for us today, but it was a relative who was not content to just say, "Oh yeah, I've heard about your situation, I'll pray for you." Well, great. If I'm hungry, I need more than your prayers. I need something to eat. A kinsman redeemer, it wasn't enough just to say, well, you know, the stuff that I'd give to Goodwill a couple of times a year, I'll pass it on to you. I'll give you my leftovers. No, a kinsman redeemer was somebody who said, I look at you and I know for starters we're related. That means you're one of us, I'm one of you. And that means I've got to get, as a kinsman redeemer, I've got to get down and dirty involved in your situation. Making sure that your land is saved, that you have a place to live. And a kinsman redeemer who went all the way would actually get married. This is the ultimate commitment. I'm going to get involved in your situation to redeem you and your situation. Well, Jesus is, of course, the ultimate example of that. The writer of Hebrews says of Jesus, both the one who makes people holy, that's Jesus, and those who are made holy, that's us, they're of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. Isn't that a great line? That when we talk a lot about what it took for Jesus to leave heaven and come to earth, don't you just wonder sometimes when Jesus looked ahead in time, why on earth he would leave heaven and come to earth and endure the cross and all that preceded it for you and for me? I feel that way at times. I'm like, good grief. You know, I've heard that question asked, do you think he would have done it if it had just been you? And there's a lot in my heart that goes, no, not just for me. And yet I know the truth of the matter is that he would have done it, and he did do it for me, and he did do it for you. And do you know why he was so willing to do it? It's because he didn't look at us and go, those sorry, compromising, lazy, good-for-nothing scoundrels. I guess I'm going to have to leave heaven and try and do something to clean them up. That wasn't his attitude at all. He looked at us and with a heart of love said, the Father made every one of them to be my brothers and my sisters. And I couldn't leave my brothers and sisters in the terrible plight that they're in. I'm a kinsman redeemer. I can't just stand far off and say, well, I'll try and send you a little help here. That I've got to just get fully involved. That's what Boaz did. He got involved to the point of marrying and having kids and spending the rest of his life with Ruth. It's a great model for us that when we follow Jesus' example, it doesn't mean you go marry half the world, but it does mean when you see needs, especially in your circle and in your family, you get involved, you get your hands dirty, you get connected, and you help. And then the sixth and final thing that we'll point out is this, that the conclusion of the story is that Ruth and Boaz's greatest impact on the world was through their progeny. It was through their descendants. The story ends abruptly, and we don't know what else Ruth and Boaz did. We don't know of them building a city or, anything great to be remembered by, but we so remember what came from them because it was their grandkids, great-grandkids. It was the line that came from them that shook the world and changed the world. And it is a great reminder for us, isn't it? That there's probably nothing that you'll do that has a greater opportunity to impact the world than how you shape the lives of your kids and how they'll touch the world. What you invest in the lives of your grandkids and how they'll impact the world. The writer of the 127th Psalm says it so powerfully, don't you see that children are God's best gift? The fruit of the womb is His generous legacy. Like a warrior's fistful of arrows are the children of a vigorous youth. Oh, how blessed are you parents with your quivers full of children. Your enemies don't stand a chance against you. You'll sweep them right off your doorstep. Those enemies, by the way, aren't flesh and blood. That's the demonic. The enemies of the kingdom of God, they don't tremble over our careers, but they do tremble to see godly men and women making disciples of their sons and daughters. And it's sort of been a disservice to parents that we've created a model in the church in the last half century that sort of says, moms and dads, be good parents, bring your kids to church so that we can teach them about Jesus. That was never God's plan. God's plan has always been for your children to be disciples that you mold. For my children to be the disciples that I mold. And when you think about what you're sowing into the lives of your kids, it really does come down to these three things more than anything else, doesn't it? When you think about what you're going to sow into your kids and your grandkids, the one thing towering above all else is to teach them, to model for them, and to train them to love, trust, and follow Jesus. And right behind that, to learn to love and trust and play well with other people. Because they're not going to count for much in life if that loving Jesus doesn't translate into learning how to get along with other people, how to love other people, how to be in trusting, give, and take relationships with other people. And there's a number 3 that has to go with the first 2. And that is to teach your kids a strong work ethic. Because a grown-up can love well, and if they don't learn how to work hard along with it, they're going to be a drain on society and on the church and on their family. And it really does pretty much boil down to those 3 things as a parent, doesn't it? Training our kids to love, trust, follow Jesus. Teaching them how to love, trust, and play well with other people. Teaching them how to work hard. And for Ruth and Boaz, we don't know what else they did in life, but they must have gotten some stuff right with their kids, because down the line, man, their kids just magnified what they had seen in their ancestors. It's kind of scary and wonderful how our children magnify what they see in us, isn't it? They'll magnify our flaws or they'll magnify our strengths. The psalmist got it right. Boy, this is God's big gift to us, to give us the opportunity to have kids to shape and mold. Would you join me as we go to the Lord together in prayer? Father, thank you for how you love and care for us. Thank you for how you pursue us. Jesus, thank you that you are for us a true kinsman redeemer. I want to ask you as we're bowed together in prayer, if maybe for the very first time in your life you need to place your trust in the Jesus who has pursued you and who cares about you, would you just do that just in a simple prayer of faith that says, Jesus, thank you for loving me. Thank you for dying for me. Thank you for counting me as a brother or sister. Would you come in my life? Would you forgive my sins? And would you change me? Would you help me to live differently now? Father, thank you for hearing and answering those prayers. There are a lot of us in the room and watching and listening online who are parents or grandparents. Ruth and Boaz's story is a great reminder that what we're sowing into the lives of our kids matters so much. Well, every parent and grandparent in the room, starting with the preacher, we see our failures really quickly. It's easy to let that dominate our thinking. Would you just choose right now by faith to leave that in the hands of God and give Him thanks that He's able to cover our failures and to be a true father to our children? But would you just ask Him today for grace, wisdom, and strength to really focus on the things that matter as a parent? To not let the past determine the future? Father, I pray that you would give us a gift today, that for every parent and grandparent under the sound of my voice, that you would show us some very specific things that we can focus on and work on that would bear fruit in the lives of our kids, that they would become faithful disciples, that they would become men and women of integrity, that they would love well, and they'd work hard. And would you show us how we can sow those things in the lives of our kids? God, thank you so much for your love. Thank you for meeting with us here today, and we pray these things, Jesus, in your name. Amen.